Good morning, everyone, and I would like to welcome you to today's book launch of the Atlas of Return Migration from the US to Mexico, authored by Claudia Masferrer. I am Isabel Gileveraert. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Seminar on Migration, Inequality, and Public Policy at El Colegio de México, and I will be chairing this conversation today. For me, it's an honor to be chairing this conversation and having everyone talk about this very relevant and important book. I think Claudia's book is one of the most comprehensive studies on return migration from US to Mexico that at least I know of. So I'm very happy to be here today with all of you. Today we have a very amazing panel of scholars who will be discussing Claudia's work. I'm sure we'll have a very interesting discussion, and a brief explanation of the dynamics. We'll have 2 rounds of questions, then some time for Claudia to react to the questions and comments of the panelists, followed by a space for Q&A from the public. And after that, we'll be having a raffle of some copies of the book. So stay until the end in case you are selected to get one of the copies. And I will be presenting each panelist before their intervention, so I will wait for that. And well, in a few minutes, I will be doing that. But first of all, I would like to introduce Claudia and give her some time to welcome everyone and quickly describe her work. So a very brief introduction of Claudia for those of you who don't know her. She is a professor at the Center for Demographic, Urban, and Environmental Studies at El Colegio de México, and she coordinates the Seminar on Migration, Inequality, and Public Policy. Her research interests center on internal and international migration, demographic and integration dynamics, inequality, and the way public policy mediates these processes. And well, she's, of course, also the author of today's book. So welcome, Claudia, and thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Isabel, for chairing the discussion, and thank you, everyone, for being here. For those who are here on WebEx after all of the technical issues, and those who are on YouTube, watching it live as well, and those who will later join the discussion. I'm really happy to be here, really happy and excited. For me, it's great to have this opportunity to talk about return migration for the second time, now in English. We had the book launch in Spanish, and I think the discussion was very rich. And especially having the book in English is significant because I do believe that discussing return migration from the US to Mexico needs to be done in both languages. And I think it's really important to have it within a global perspective. So it's interesting to have such an international panel today. But it's especially happy and for me to join this discussion and have Brian Roberts, who was the person who introduced me to the subject when I was studying at UT Austin in 2007, to have Erin Hamilton, who I started work and discussing on these issues in Austin as well, and then just having collaborators with whom I have continued working on this subject, like Nicole Denier, Victor Garcia, and just having people discussing this issue, I think it's really important. And it's particularly important to have this discussion as well with 2 great scholars who have worked on return migration, such as Russell King and Hein de Haas, and just trying to figure out how this atlas fits into migration theory more in general, I think is very important from a interdisciplinary perspective. So instead of providing you with a presentation of the atlas, I decided that it was better to actually show a video that summarizes this work. And I just want to start by saying that the motivation for doing this atlas was trying to put together a series of indicators at the state level that can help us summarize what we know. And for me, a central part was to read kind of like everything that has been published in the last years, which is a good number of publications on return, specifically to each of the states, and try to see what is pending. And I think you will see, hopefully, at the end of today's discussion, that there's still a lot of work to do. And I think that part of the reason as well of why I'm happy to have this discussion here in English, and it can always be bilingual. So if anyone wants to speak Spanish, feel free to do so. But I think part of it is also reaching out with scholars from different places that are working on these issues that sometimes go without a bridge. So I have a huge section of acknowledgements from the funding offices, but also the research assistants that helped me shape this book and how the idea also went into work. So I will not go on over all of those acknowledgements, but I really think that I'm really happy that this book was finally published with the help of everyone. And I think we can see the video, and I think we'll have a lot of time for discussing the issues. And just bear in mind throughout the whole discussion that for me, place was really important, and just trying to understand how, as we said, Brian and I, many years ago, how the demography and the geography of return matter. So it matters a lot who returns and where do they return to. So in this atlas, that's what I try to do. I try to stress out the idea that return will differ by demography and geography, who comes back, where to, and just try to bear in mind that if you have not been in Mexico, that Mexico is definitely many, many Mexicos. So let's put the video, and thanks for being here. And I hope that we'll have a lot of time to talk about these issues. Mexican migrants return to their home country after living in the United States for a number of reasons. Some go back for family, economic, or health concerns, or because they miss their country. Others come back after a deportation proceeding, and others to avoid one. More often than before, return occurs after living many years abroad, so Mexico may seem foreign. While some return migrants arrive alone and leave their families behind in the United States, others return together as a family. When coming back, many returnees arrive with children and adolescents born in the United States. The population of returned migrants and the US-born are dispersed throughout the country. Their characteristics are diverse, as well as their needs for integrating into Mexican society. Mexico is an unequal country. Coming back to a rural community in western Mexico, a border city in the north, a municipality on the periphery of a metropolitan area, or to an indigenous community will be different and imply unique challenges. In the Atlas of Return Migration from the United States to Mexico, I present a summary of results by state. I compiled key indicators to understand how the characteristics of these populations differ by place. I also listed pertinent literature analyzing each state's situation, together with an appraisal of outstanding concerns and open questions in light of present-day realities. The research published on this topic is broad, leaving open many questions for us to work on. I invite you to read this atlas, to learn about the demographic and geographic variations of return to Mexico, and to think about how we can tailor policy and programs to these variations. Some of us have a compass for returning home. Others are searching for pathways to Mexico. For many, home is in the United States, and their compass points north after returning to Mexico.
Well, thank you, Claudia, and thank you for that great video that summarizes, at least in part, what the work includes. Okay, so I think we can start with the first round of interventions by the panelists. And we have a broad question, which I think will leave a good amount of opinions and conversations around the Atlas. So the first leading question would be, what do the panelists think that we can learn from this Atlas in terms of US Mexican migration broadly? And we can start with Brian Roberts. I'm going to briefly introduce him before he speaks. Brian Roberts is an anthropologist and sociologist, and he's currently professor emeritus at the University of Texas at Austin. He's the director of the Mexican Center and was the director of the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies. And some of his latest projects are a project on self-sustaining community development in Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Peru, as well as 2 projects on urbanization in Latin America. So Professor Roberts, you've got the floor.
Thank you. Well, we can learn a lot from the Atlas, clearly, and I won't go into its many achievements, but it is a beautiful compilation of data, and data broken down by state and by other important variables, as we know, education, level of employment, and so on. What I want to concentrate, however, is on the first round, is on 2 major points. One is perhaps a self-evident point, and that is that one of the interesting things that the Atlas demonstrates is that return migration occurs in every state of Mexico, no matter how remote or how small. It's occurring everywhere. Of course, there is considerable variation in the size of that return migration. So that's not similar, but the fact of return migration is similar. And within that statement, however, there's important variations. And that is that not all states, even states of similar size, have similar rates of return migration. For example, if we take the largest states, the great Mexican conglomeration in which Claudia and Isabella are now seated, is, that is the largest conglomeration in Mexico. It's vast, it's 20 million or so, and yet its return migration rates on the 3 periods of migration are less than that of Jalisco, which is a much smaller state, about a third of the size of the conglomeration, but has more return migration. So this illustrates one thing, and this you'll find repeated, that many of the states like Jalisco, which have a long history of migration, that path dependence that you get of migration continues to the present. Zacatecas, much smaller state than Jalisco, of course, but it has a very high rate of return migration. Actually, a higher rate than many states, much larger than itself. And you could carry on that analysis down into the small return migration states and smaller states. Why, for example, should Chiapas, which is a larger state in population than Oaxaca, have less return migration than Oaxaca? So we can clearly see by that, that knowing that Mexico is full of return migrations, and no state of Mexico, you're not likely to run into somebody who's been to the United States and come back. At the same time, we have to explain why there is variation in the rate of return migration to the various states of Mexico. It's not the time to speculate. That's the time for you all to do the research, which would precisely take those points up. And clearly we can see some of the points that would, some of which are path dependent, how states got involved in return migration in the first place. Remember that Jalisco has been a long time return migration state because of its involvement in the nature of its involvement in the Civil War, the Cristiada, etc., etc. It was a state that was on offer to displace its migrants. And Mexico wasn't a good place to displace them to then, but the United States was. Okay, that's enough of that. The second thing I want to talk about is the importance of the economic crises, which comes absolutely clear in the three periods. The one thing which is a very consistent pattern in the return migration book, which you can find looking through it, is that the rate of return migration in all over Mexico, without exception, it follows a similar pattern. It's small. The smallest rate is at the beginning of the period, 1995 to 2000. It's largest in the next period, which is, I'll have to look again at those things. 2005 to 2010. And it then goes down again, the return migration in the final period, but not as low as it was in 2000. That's in the 2015 period, 10 to 15. Okay. Now, of course, what's significant about 2005, 2010 is the period of the American recession, which does affect Mexico as well. So that really does seem to have, that economic factor does seem to have rejected migration in two ways. People couldn't find jobs, so they went back home, or at least they may find family support, etc. for that. And the other kind of thing is deportations. And deportation policy tightens up in the United States. Certainly in that period, people were overwhelmed, floods of Mexicans and taking everybody's jobs, which we know was not true, but that was the current, idea. So there we have a consistent impact of an economic migration on it. And the big question that, would arise from that for me too is my final point is what we need to know about the policies and how we can better coordinate them to destinations and migrant policies in origin. There's been a momentous lack of coordination between Mexico and the United States in terms of coordinating migration policy. It seems nothing to do with reality, a great deal to do with posturing politically on both sides of the border. Okay, that's all I want to say.
Thank you, Professor Roberts. And yes, I agree that one of the most important, or at least for me, outcomes of this book is having all that data and all that information to see how things have changed historically and how there's some patterns, but there's also this connection between policy and reality, and perhaps this book will illustrate that reality and inform policy in a better way. Next, I want to ask Professor Hamilton for her opinions. Professor Erin Hamilton is an associate professor of sociology and affiliate of the UC Davis Center for Poverty and Inequality Research at the UC Davis Global Migration Center and the Hemispheric Institute on the Americas. Most of her research has focused on Mexico-US migration, how, when, and why people migrate. So Professor Hamilton, take the floor.
Can you hear me? It's such an honor to be here commenting on this book. Thank you, Claudia, for inviting me, and in particular to be a member of this really terrific panel of speakers. I was on sabbatical at El Colegio de Mexico in 2019 as Claudia's visitor at CEDUA, working with her on a project on return migration to Mexico City. And she was also working on the Atlas during that time. And so in addition to reading the book, I'm aware of the tremendous undertaking it was to analyze 3 waves of Mexican census data across 32 states in order to produce this accounting, very precise, accurate accounting description of the vast, diverse, and demographically important population of migrants arriving to Mexico during the last 20 years. In addition to the utility of this demographic description of return migrants in Mexico, Claudia gives us in the Atlas a bibliography of the scholarship on return migration to Mexico organized by state. And for myself and for other readers who may not be as up to date on the table of contents of Mexican journals and major presses, this bibliography is going to direct our attention to fundamental works about family life, health, school access, intergenerational mobility, labor market integration, identity, gender, politics, and rural development as they relate to return migration. So the Atlas is a tremendous resource for understanding migration between Mexico and the United States, which by the end of the first decade of the 20th century involved more people heading from the US to Mexico than vice versa, which was a reversal of trends from the prior 4 decades. So scholars of migration tend to focus on the initial emigration with an E, the initial out migration, but the study of return migration teaches us about migration trajectories and cycles, as well as about social and economic reintegration. One of the books that initially drew me to the study of international migration was Dino Seinel's From Italy to San Francisco, which was a history of Italian migration to the United States in the beginning of the 20th century. And when Seinel wrote the book in 1982, or that's when it was published, he began from the assimilation era assumption of migration as a one-directional permanent move that not only involved economic mobility and of course spatial mobility, but also social mobility from the old to the new. What Seinel's book taught us was that the vast majority of Italians sought to return to Italy when they left for the Western Hemisphere, and many in fact did. As Claudia just said in her introductory comments, the study of who returned and to where teaches us about the reasons for immigration in the first place, as well as the experiences of immigration and integration. And in particular, it teaches us that immigration is often a short-term project that takes advantage of a trip away from home in order to solve problems at home. Return migration to Mexico in 2010 is a shorter, less costly trip than return migration to Italy was in 1910. And so we may see return migration to Mexico as the exemplary case study of what it means to return migrate, as the case will offer a full accounting of experiences and, for demographers, huge samples to use in our models of when, where, and why migrants move, and with what consequences for the communities they leave and enter. So as Brian pointed out, Claudia's atlas reminds us that the Mexican case of return migration in the first part of the 21st century was a colossal nature dispersed throughout the Mexican territory, touching every municipality. She also brings our attention, so one of the things that's important that we learn, to an important component of the Mexico-US migration flow during this period, which cannot be characterized as return migration. That's of the migration of children born in the United States. Children born in the United States are making their first migration trip to Mexico, so they cannot be said to be returning. So Claudia therefore draws a crucial and precise demographic distinction between a returnee, someone who left and came back, and an immigrant, someone who's born elsewhere, arriving for the first time to a new country. Even though in the case of migration from Mexico, from the United States to Mexico in the early 2000s, the returnee and the first-time immigrant are members of the same family. So I'm a demographer and I'm accustomed to tables that present comparisons. So as I read through the atlas, I sought to find differences across states in the patterns of the data that Claudia analyzed. And I found a few that are worth noting and investigating. And so here are a few things that I learned from Claudia's book. So Brian already mentioned this, but the first one is that the period between 2005 and 2010 was unique because of the huge numbers of returnees counted in that period. So this resulted in a hump shape of the period estimates of return migration from 2000 to 2010 to 2015. So at the national level, there were 800,000 returnees in Mexico in 2010, which was 3 times the number counted in 2000. This number then declined by about half to 430,000 returnees counted in 2015. And we saw that same decline in places like Zacatecas and Guanajuato, in fact, of a more dramatic nature. So in Zacatecas, you saw the number of returnees fall from 27,000 in 2010 to 11,000 in 2015. And Guanajuato fell from 70,000 to 30,000. Okay, so I'm going to return to each of these points to pose questions for research in the second round of comments, so I'll just stop there for now. But I will repeat, as Brian already did, that this same basic pattern was observed in all 32 states with some important variation. Okay, so a second point is about educational selectivity into immigration. Educational selectivity or migrant selectivity is the extent to which migrants are different from non-migrants in some outcome or characteristic, and in this case, I'm going to focus on educational attainment. The atlas shows us that return migrant educational selectivity varies by state. So I focused on the share of the population with 0 to 9 years of schooling, and in 2015, and in doing so, you will see that in most states, there's a larger share of migrants in this lower segment of the schooling attainment compared to non-migrants in most states. But this is especially true in states in the traditional migrant sending regions, so Zacatecas, Michoacán, Jalisco, and Guanajuato. So these are places where migrants are disproportionately returning to rural localities, as shown by the urban-rural distribution that Claudia produced, and where there's a substantial history of migration, which reduces the cost of migration through social capital and networks. By contrast, we see positive educational selectivity, at least in terms of that bottom of the distribution, at 0 to 9 years of attainment in border states, including Baja California, Sonora, Sinaloa, and in Mexico City, as well as in some Gulf Coast tourist states where migrants are returning to the tourist industry, Yucatan and Quintana Roo. So this state variation, I'm going to return to some research implications, but it reminds us of the problem of taking a national approach or using national data to make broad claims about migration. And to repeat Claudia's basic point, place matters. So one final thing I learned in reading this book, also a point about state variation, had to do with gender. So I observed large state differences in the sex ratios of returnees. So in the Mexican national average in 2015, 32% of returnees were women. In Campeche, Quintana Roo, and Yucatan, 1 in 5 returnees were women, so that's a rate of 20%. At the other end of the distribution were states like Nuevo León, Tabasco, Coahuila, and Sinaloa, where 40% of returnees were women. But the place with the largest share of women was Mexico City, where nearly half, 47% of returnees in 2015 were women. So each of these patterns, and there are many more in the book, but the ones that I focus on suggests a complementary set of research questions. And I'm going to return to those questions in my speculation about the answers and how one would go about answering those questions in the second round of comments.
Thank you, Professor Hamilton. And I also agree with you that this book is both fascinating in itself, but it's also an invitation and a provocation for future research and a resource to keep reading things and keep exploring both local and structural dynamics, such as the impact of economic crisis and other things and how they impact at the local level. So thank you for that. And we're going to continue with Professor De Haas. So Hein De Haas is a sociologist and geographer who has taught and worked in the Netherlands, Morocco, and the United Kingdom. He is currently professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam, and he was a founding member and co-director of the International Migration Institute at the University of Oxford. And in his work, Professor De Haas has advanced a long-term view of migration as an integral part of global change and development. So we look forward to hearing your thoughts, Professor De Haas.
You hear me now?
Yes, we do.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for inviting me to this seminar. I apologize for coming in late. I was at a meeting in the city and I just came in biking, so I apologize for the slight delay. Once again, thanks for inviting me. I feel a little bit humbled because I also feel a little bit embarrassed, let's put it that way, because I wouldn't pretend I'm a specialist on Mexican migration. And by looking through the atlas, I realized even more how little I know about Mexican migration. And that is actually what I learned from Mexican migration. In a way, what I knew from Mexican migration, that it's been diversifying a lot. And that is, I think, a pattern you see in a lot of outmigration countries that have a long history of outmigration, that it often started in a few states, and then you have this geographical diffusion. And the things I've learned in the past, what I found quite fascinating about the Mexican-US migration, you see both a diversification in terms of destinations, of course, within the US, in which now Mexico can be found anywhere in the US, beyond the traditional destinations. But you can see the same from the origin side. So I'm betraying my origins as a geographer, always interested in geographical diffusion processes. But I think, of course, reading the atlas and seeing all the wonderful statistics just made me realize again this diversity of migrations. But it also spoke to this idea that there has been this diffusion, because you see very different, it's been mentioned already by my predecessors today, there's very different patterns, not just in outmigration, but also in return migration, which, well, will trigger a few questions I may ask later in the second round, but really maps quite wonderfully how diverse this experience has been, and how difficult it indeed is to speak about the Mexican migration experience. I'm probably stating the total obvious for all Mexico experts here and our Mexican colleagues, but I think looking, let's say, from the outside, Mexico is often sort of cast as this one of those labor exporters, and it sort of glances over the huge diversity of the return migration experience. What I find really fascinating, has been mentioned before as well, is the what's been called the hump-shaped pattern. Again, it triggered a number of questions because, well, let me at least reveal one question that this atlas provoked in me. Yes, I think it is plausible that obviously both the economic crisis and the deportation, sort of the increased effort in deportations, plays a role there. But another question I had, just a curiosity I got here, is to what extent do also processes of social and economic transformation in Mexico play a role in this process? But I probably better come back to that issue in the second round. Another thing that fascinated me was indeed the high diversity in, if you look at whether people return to rural versus urban environments. And what I also found interesting, that in some states the trend seemed reversed, because I would have expected that you would see a universal tendency towards people who are increasingly returning to urban areas, simply because Mexico, and I guess all regions in Mexico, are urbanizing to a certain extent. But you could actually find juxtaposed patterns. And that was something I totally hadn't expected. And again, I don't know enough to give you any solid answers, but indeed, it shows to me how valuable this experience is of really doing this much more detailed mapping on a regional level. And as any good piece of research, again, I would really like to congratulate you for compiling this atlas. I think it triggers more questions, of course, and it gives definite answers. But that is only, I think, very sort of something to congratulate you for rather than criticize you for. So there's a lot of questions coming behind this, and I've never seen such a systemic effort in mapping return migrations through time, and also by all these different demographic dimensions. So I have understood that we have to leave the questions for the second round. Am I correct?
I mean, yes, we can talk about some of the questions now, but ideally we can talk about all the questions that this sort of provoked in the next round.
Okay, let me stop here then. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor De Haas. And finally, to conclude this round, we'll have Professor Russell King, who is a professor of geography at the University of Sussex. Previously, he has been professor of geography at Trinity College in Dublin and lecturer in geography at the University of Leicester. I have no idea how to pronounce. King has directed major research projects on return migration, migration as a global phenomenon, international student migration, and second-generation return migration to Greece and Cyprus. So, Professor King, you get the opportunity to conclude this first round.
Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, it's pronounced Leicester, very, very simple, Leicester. So yeah, well, a bit like my predecessor, Hein De Haas, I come to this discussion as very much an external observer, absolutely not an expert. And therefore, some of my comments perhaps reflect a kind of more detached perspective, particularly than the first two speakers, Brian and Erin, who I see were even endorsers of the atlas on the back cover of the volume. So yeah, let me start off by adding my congratulations to the author for preparing and publishing such a splendid volume. I'm going to give you firstly my initial reactions, and then maybe float, if I may, a few more, slightly critical comments. They're meant in a very kind of constructive and friendly way, so I hope they don't come over as too critical. And in fact, my first point is a sort of critical point, because when I leafed through the atlas, when I picked it up and leafed through it, the thing that surprised me was that how few maps there were in the atlas. For me, the word atlas means lots and lots of maps. Maybe that's a very traditional view of what an atlas should be, but when you flip through the pages, actually it's mainly tables and graphs rather than maps. There is a collection of maps at the beginning, and of course that's fine. But I was kind of struck by the fact that this is an atlas with actually quite few maps, and instead lots of tables and lots of graphs. Okay, what do I learn from the atlas? I learned from the atlas, I think, four major things, which partly reflect my lack of previous research engagement with Mexico and the US. Firstly, that return migration has a long history. It's not a recent phenomenon, but it goes back more or less as far as the history of Mexican migration, and that, I guess, is what we should expect. Secondly, that it's quantitatively huge, and again, I guess that's not too much of a surprise, because we know from the sort of global databases like the one that the World Bank produces every now and again that the migration from Mexico to the US is the largest single bilateral migration in the world. So therefore, we would expect return migration to be quantitatively very large as well. Thirdly, and this has been the focus very much in the discussion that I've listened to so far, that it has a very marked regional patterning. Like Heinta Haas, I have an origin as a geographer. In fact, I still like to identify as a geographer, and therefore this regional patterning is really important for my interest in regions and place and space and so on. And fourthly, I learned that, of course, returnees have certain kinds of social, economic, and demographic characteristics. They are not a cross-section of the immigrant population, nor are they a cross-section of the Mexican population in Mexico. There are filters and selectivity going on there. So those are the things what I learn. Let me now move to perhaps a more sort of forensic analysis of the statistics, not in the kind of detail that we've heard from Brian and Erin and Hein, but more the way in which they are calculated and presented. I was quite surprised that you use absolute figures. So the figures that you use by state are absolute figures, and that's, I think, precisely why Brian was moved to kind of contrast and begin a contrast between the different rates. But what do we mean by rates? In order to have a relative idea of the impact of return migration, those absolute figures should be standardized by the population totals of each of the states to which the migrants are returning, and then you would have a dual view which would explain both sides of the picture. You have the absolute view, which you have in the atlas at the moment, but you also would have the relative view of which states were attracting proportionately more bigger numbers of returnees in proportion to their population. But then things can get a little bit more complicated, because another way of measuring the rate of return migration is to compare it not with the resident population in each state, but with the number of immigrants who have left that state. Because some states may have a greater ability to attract back their immigrants, whereas others may have a lesser attraction. And I'm reminded here of some early fiddling around with mapping return migration I did in the case of Italy. Actually, Erin mentioned Dino Cinel's well-known work on Italian migration to the United States. But Italy has quite detailed migration statistics. And one of the things I did way back was to compare the return migration rates to the 20 regions of Italy, and I compared them with the emigration that had left from those regions in earlier decades. And what I found, I mean, was perhaps not surprising, but southern regions, southern Italy being the most underdeveloped part of the country, southern regions had very weak abilities to attract back their migrants. So maybe only 20% of the emigrants would come back to a region like Calabria or Basilicata, which are, you know, mountainous, poor regions. But a region like Piedmont or Lombardy, you know, which is where big cities and industries are, Milan, Turin, and so on, would actually attract back more returnees than they had sent out emigrants. Okay, so this was an interesting indication of another spatial process, which I would love to know more about in the Mexican case, which is, do returnees go back to the states which they left in the first place? Or do they leave from one state and maybe go back to another? And therefore, a kind of process of internal redistribution of population takes place via the circuit, which leads via emigration and return migration. And we can think of various reasons why returnees might go back to a different state than the one they left. And the key one will be the economic motivation that, you know, they're more likely to get a job in Mexico City or in one of the maquiladores towns along the border than perhaps they would be in their rural state or village or town of origin. And then another mechanism might be through family networks. So if two Mexican migrants, hypothetically a man and a woman, migrate and meet in the United States, they get married and then they think about returning. Do they go back to the husband's state of origin, or do they go back to the wife's state of origin? You know, what is the relative strength of family connections? Those are some of the slightly more critical perspectives I have to bear. I mean, I have to bring to the discussion. I was really interested also to, maybe I'll mention this here, but it could be also in my second sort of intervention later on, but let me just bring it out here also, because Erin referred in some detail to this issue of the Mexican-born versus the US-born returnees. And of course, strictly speaking, from a demographic statistical point of view, the US-born children are not returnees, although because of family connections and because of maybe some notion of returning to a kind of parental homeland, maybe kind of ontologically they are thinking that they are returning, particularly if they have kept in touch with Mexico through frequent visits and having spent, you know, some time there on holiday and so on. So this is a problematic group. I mean, not only in terms of how we define them as returnees or not, but also in terms of their lives and their educational prospects. And this is an area, I think, of tremendous research interest for the future. The challenges that are faced by the children of returnees, the children that are brought back, sometimes against their will. I mean, as young children, they don't have agency in their return process. So they're carted back by their parents. And then, of course, they have to face you know, a new education system, a new language, a new set of friends, a whole set of kind of cultural challenges for them. And just one final point, also on the question of the second generation. I wonder if there's any data, I don't think I found it in the atlas, about what I would call adult second generation returnees. So still US born, but people who decide as adults, often as young adults, that they want to go back, they want to go to Mexico, whether it's back to Mexico. I mean, it depends how you frame the sort of the return the return process, because in other migration settings, and I have researched Greek Americans and also Turkish Germans in terms of second generation return with collaborators Anastasia Christou and Nilay Klunch respectively. And I found that in those instances, there is quite a notable phenomenon of adult second generation return for emotional reasons. It's kind of called roots migration sometimes driven by economic reasons, also by family connections and so on. And I wonder whether that's evident in the Mexican case, where perhaps also for lifestyle reasons. I mean, we also know, of course, that American citizens, US citizens, also migrate to Mexico for lifestyle reasons. There's literature on places like San Miguel, the Lake Chiapas Riviera, Baja California, where US citizens have either retired or moved at a younger age for lifestyle reasons. And one could envisage perhaps that second generation Mexican Americans might also want to do that. Okay, that's all for the time being, and look forward to listening to further rounds of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor King. And I forgot to mention that Professor King is also the author of the Handbook of Return Migration and the Atlas of Migration. So I apologize for that omission. And before concluding this this first round, I would like to give Claudia the opportunity to briefly react to this first set of questions, comments, and praise, and then we'll continue to the second round.
Thank you everyone for well, the four of you for reading the atlas and providing comments. It's always nice to get reactions and criticisms and just like try to discuss the issues that also went were not enough. So I think just to very briefly react, I think it's so, I mean, the first question was, okay, how do we, I mean, there's a lot of lack of coordination between Mexico and the United States. I agree. I think that part of the issue is that we need to think or rethink how we conceive a binational population, transborder families in the Mexico and the US. And so these can maybe bring on some ideas on what return means. And I think having the US-born children and adults, I mean, I'll go back to the adult piece, which is amazing, is definitely something that we can start off, but to try to conceive better coordination. So in other work that I've done, more policy-oriented, I've discussed how I think that this population of returnees and US-born migrants in Mexico can probably help shape the discussions of policy, both in Mexico and the US, a little bit differently. I love the discussion of Italians. I remember that more than 10 years ago, when I was starting to think about these issues, Brian and I discussed how, I mean, return from Italy is different, return from other European countries would be different, and especially because there was always this socially expected duration of migration that would be different because Mexico and the US are so close. And Mexicans, I mean, if you talk to a Mexican in the US, they will tell you that they'll go back next Christmas, and this has happened for 25 years, right? But they do not go back, and I think that return also makes us think about those who do not return, and those are the ones that we study more often when we think from the perspective of the immigration country. But one of the reasons why I was interested in return from the first place was for a very personal motivation as the children of migrants in Mexico from Argentina and Peru, that they never went back to their home country. I would always imagine how my life would change if they ever decide to go back, and if I would become one of these immigrants in their parental homeland, what would that mean, right? And I think this idea of the second generation growing up in a country and thinking how the country of their parents, what does it mean, is definitely something that it's interesting, right? And we've discussed that in terms of immigration countries, but I think in the case of Mexico, it's not as clear. The gender piece, I think, opens many questions, and I will not go over there, but I think it's definitely something that we'll be looking more into detail. Heinz's comment on economic transformation, I think, is key. I think there was definitely economic transformation leading up and guiding many of these issues. On the piece that I published in 2012 with Brian, we wanted to, I mean, we measured a rate similar to what Russell King mentioned in terms of trying to figure out those who were abroad and left. And I have to say that there is very bad immigration data in Mexico, even if we are an immigration country. So the statistics on immigration are really hard to conceive and compute, especially when we have complete households that leave, right? Because usually what we capture is the immigration of those, did someone from the household leave, right? But that means that someone stayed. And I think considering how the reality of Mexican migration has changed, it's open to many biases. But back then, when Brian and I did the exercise, we did find that states like Quintana Roo, border states, tourist states, were actually capturing way more returnees than they actually sent over the years. But you also need to think, and I think that's something that's very important in US-Mexico migration, is that the duration of the stays of those that are in the United States are huge and will be hardly identified with census every 5 years, right? So data estimates from the Pew Research Center show that the median time of a Mexican undocumented migrant in the United States, it's 17 years. Less than 10% have been there for 5 years, right? And you have just very long periods of stay, and it would be great to actually try to see who left when, and then try to calculate these rates. So I always actually went back and forth with how to show these maps, and I agree. It's an atlas that could have way more maps. And the reason why I decided not to show rates was because I think that they're more confusing to understand for a wide public. And it's true that returnees are everywhere, but at the same time, there are places that, I mean, that have few returnees. But I really wanted to show how within each of state, you could actually go and try to find those regions that were capturing more. So, I mean, I went back and forth, and I guess I'll show in the second edition the rates. The other very interesting idea, and I think is finally is this idea of this problematic group of US-born migrants in Mexico. And there is some indication that we do have an arrival of adults. And we focused on the minors because in the work that I did with Erin and Nicole on characterizing this population of US-born minors, we actually were able to estimate how many of them were living in their household with a mother or a father that was born in Mexico. And now, when you are adults, it's more likely that you will not live with your parents or your mothers, so with your parents. So it was hard to estimate, but I mean, the majority of these children are living with a Mexican parent. You also see US-born mothers, especially, that are joining fathers, Mexican fathers and their children. We do not know if these adults are Mexican-American. But when you see when you see the family composition, I think that and you know that there are Mexican-American adults in families in the US, you could potentially predict that some of them are actually of Mexican origin. But what's interesting is that in a different project with Victor Manuel Garcia, we're using birth certificates of US-born migrants in Mexico that claim Mexican citizenship. And when you see the age distribution, you see that most of them are in school ages, but you do see adults that claim Mexican citizenship. So this could be an indication that they probably were joining some returnees. We don't know, because we don't know who they migrated with, but they are claiming Mexican citizenship. And now about half of the population of US-born migrants in Mexico have also a Mexican citizenship. So half of them are binational citizens, even if many of them could actually acquire Mexican citizenship later. So I think that this group that is problematic for many reasons actually opens a lot of questions in terms of citizenship studies, family studies, and just trying to understand how maybe a Mexican American in the United States in Mexico, joining Returnees finds some incentives to actually acquire Mexican citizenship. I think this will definitely be very, very, very interesting. Anyway, I'll just leave it there because I really want to hear the other set of questions, but thanks for the comments. And yeah, I went back and forth in terms of how to show the maps, and I really like the criticism of, well, where are the maps? I thought that actually you were gonna say where are the names of all those municipalities, because I don't know which municipality we're talking about, and for illustrative reasons I decided not to have them, but I know that it's always hard to show maps for people who are not aware of Mexican geography as well. Anyway, thanks for your comments.
Thank you, Claudia. And I think, well, all these things could be, as you say, incorporated into a next edition of the Atlas with tons of maps and a lot of gender statistics and processes and other things. So maybe it's some homework to think of for the future. And so we're going to start with the second round of comments. And in this case, I would like to ask you, from your research expertise, how does this atlas inform return migration specifically and migration processes more generally within a global perspective? And where do you think the discipline should move forward in order to answer pending questions and new research questions that emerge with this kind of work? And as the previous round, we'll start with Professor Roberts, followed by Professor Hamilton, then Professor De Haas, and finally Professor King. So, adelante, Professor Roberts.
Hello. So it's okay. Now my comments really are directed to the global implications of Mexico. Difficult, because Mexico is exceptional. It's the only country that's less developed that shares a border, as we know, with a highly developed country. And so that's, that's a problem. Okay, so the global implications of what we're seeing here have to be rather general. First, one thing I think that you have to take account of in discussing international trends in migration, especially international migration, but also rural-urban migration, is the fact of the changes in the birth rate and survival rate of populations throughout the world. In Mexico, the birth rate and survival rate was very high in the part of the 20th century between about 1940 to 1980, okay? At very high rates of survival, therefore population was growing rapidly. And in 1940, Mexico was predominantly a rural state. By 1980, the population growth was dropping sharply and has dropped sharply ever since. So now the Mexican population is almost near to just survival rate, okay? But at the same time, what happened to that huge increase in population? It was not absorbed in the rural areas where people were born. It was absorbed in the cities. And Mexican cities grew very rapidly from 1940 to 1980. And they grew rapidly in a peculiar way. It's so normal now, we don't think of it. And that is through primacy, through the rapid growth of the biggest cities. And so that the population not simply increased, but concentrated to the extent that the growth of the cities became, at one point in that period, the mainly accounted for by in-migration, not natural increase within the city, which is the normal way in which cities increase, and now is the case in Mexico, and has been now for some years. So that's one general thing to put into this. So one way of looking about the horror, inverted commas, of Mexican migration is, and the danger it poses to the United States, which has been a kind of a theme in American political discussions for many, many years, and still is. So one way to look at that is that actually the Mexican cities saved the United States from excessive Mexican migration, because most of the Mexican international migrants were absorbed by the Mexican cities, not by the United States. So the internal migration in Mexico from rural area to city was much greater than the internal migration from rural areas to the United States. And you can trace it in the life, and we did that in projects in years past. The early migration of people of the Bracero generation, the 60s kind of place, they typically, yes, they'd go to the United States for jobs, came back, that was part of the condition of the thing, and on the whole stayed. And then if they moved, and they did move, they moved from their village of origin, where they were recruited to the Bracero program, to in the Jalisco case, where the data was from, you moved to Guadalajara. So it is the Mexican city, Guadalajara, that got the migration, not the United States. Okay, and so that, and of course, international migration was anyway stopped, as we indicated, by deportations at different periods, heavy deportations in the 1930s from places like Los Angeles, but also, of course, what was to happen in the 21st century now, as not only the Republican presidents, but even the Democratic ones like Barack Obama, sort of facilitated deportations back to Mexico. Okay, so that's one thing of the global context. Yes, you have to remember the impact of changing rates of natural increase. You have to remember the fact that the rural population, every country in the world, is now an increasingly declining part of that country. Okay. Then that brings you, what are then the economic trends globally that can also affect migration? And of course, that's one of them, the change of every country's economy towards urban economies and away from rural economies, so that rural employment is actually increasingly smaller percent of a country's employment. I mean, in the United States, it was, well, I have the figures somewhere here, but while it was very high in the turn of the century, you might have things as high as 60% at the, in the very early 1900s, engaged in rural activities. By now, it's down to about 6, 7, 8%. It's very small. In Mexico, that happens also. Mexican rural population in 1940 was very, very high. It was 60, 70%, whatever. Yeah, I had the figures, but then I've lost them. Okay, but those are figures easy to get. And now the Mexican rural population is down, way down. It's only about 16% of the population. It's like Texas. Once the preeminently rural state of Mexico, vaqueros, cowboys, and everything like that, now the population of Texas is concentrated in 5 mega metropolises. And so which encompass about 82% of the Texas population. There's very few people living in this famous rural hinterland of Texas. It hasn't affected voting that much, but it has affected it. So it's mainly an urban population now in Texas too. So those things are important to remember, because that means that when we're talking about migration in the period we are talking about it, we're also talking about migration in a time of changing nature of job opportunities. The first migrants from Mexico went predominantly to rural places to work in farms, usually in California or Texas, in large-scale farms, etc. They needed that cheap labor. As time went on, the destination of migrations switched from rural areas to urban areas. And people began working in domestic activities, including, of course, working around the gardens and the famous, kind of leaf blowers of California. We have them in Texas too, who are basically mainly Mexican origin and spend their time and get a reasonable salary for it, getting rid of the leaves that we seem to have in abundance in places like Austin. And so that kind of thing, but not just that, keeping the yards of a predominantly white middle and upper middle class, clear, etc. Working in the houses of those that mainly white middle and upper class that you have in places like Texas. So the work becomes things. It's also in construction. And, it's in the house that you're looking at, for me, it's in a fairly close area of the city of Austin on the hills. And when I go out for my walk, as I try to keep fit more or less, is who do I see? I see Mexican origin people all the time. I don't see my white neighbors. Well, they're not just white now. They're also Asian, American, etc., etc. But there's, but I don't see Mexican origin migrants much in my neighborhood at all. But I do see them as workers around that neighborhood. And when I walk, they're the ones that are in public. My white neighbors don't come in public, because they stay in their house, get in their cars like me, and drive out to somewhere else. Okay, so that's one thing to do. Yeah, of course, the implication of the switch to urban economies for migrants is that, again, migration changes its structural dynamic from being temporary to structurally permanent. The jobs, urban jobs, are year-round. It's very unusual to have temporary urban jobs. So that, these are usually with brief periods, maybe for bad weather or whatever, that some of those jobs cannot operate. But on the whole, you're going towards permanent work, etc. So this increases the impetus for people to stay on. But also, of course, it means they are liable when deportation policies increase to be deported if they don't have documents. And so the other issue about the urban nature of migration is that networks become quite important they've always been important, of course, but much more important under urban conditions than under, oddly enough, rural conditions. Don't need a network when you've got a job in a large kind of cotton picking plantation or whatever it is, because the terms of the job gives you, the terms of the job and when you go. If you're in the city, you're going to need networks to survive, especially if you don't have documents. And the serious documents, which are really residence and the permission to work in the United States, which is not easily given to people who would like to migrate. So that in that kind of condition, they're going to have to rely upon networks of people. And that's part of the path dependence of migration. One reason that people follow migrants, in places like Jalisco, is they go to places where Jalisco migrants are, because it's where they can go. When one of my colleagues traced the migration of a small village in the Sierra del Tigre in Jalisco to the United States, and then to Hawaii. They all went to Hawaii, and soon this little village was full of ex-migrants to Hawaii because they sent the children back home because it was easier to raise them there with the grandparents and so on. So again, you have a different kind of networks important, but also increasing perhaps the path dependence of migration. So you go to places where you have existing migrants. For people who don't have it, it's very difficult. And my suspicion is, though I don't think we have enough work on that, is that it's those kind of people that are more likely to be deported. They get less protection. If you have networks, you can even get a driver's license. If you don't, you don't. Okay? Okay, and the last point I want to make on this general point, because it applies to other countries, not just Mexico, new means of communication. The cell phone revolution, that hit me once when I was negotiating with a friend of mine who is a Mexican-American entrepreneur. And I said, look, I need this job done. I don't know, it may need extra labor, blah, blah, blah. He said, no problem, he said. I'll have them up here by Monday. I was talking to him on Saturday or something. I said, what do you mean? How are you going to get them up here this quickly? From Mexico, you know. He said, oh, no problem. I'll give him a call on my cell phone now. And the cell phone is a means for mobilizing migration, organizing it and things became an important element in the nature of migration and return migration. The information you needed to make a decision, is it time for me to go back if you have a choice, or is it not the time to go back? Is it time for me to go, etc. Okay, that's all I want to say now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Roberts. And I want to give the floor to Professor Hamilton for her reactions in this second round.
Thank you. So I'm going to return to the 3 points I made previously that about things I learned looking at the patterns in the book in the atlas. And the first one was this 2005-2010 hump pattern where you see very high levels or large populations of returnees in that period compared to the prior and the following. And I noted that so there were declines in all states between 2010 and 2015 and the size of recent returnees in Mexico in every state, but there were some notable places where there was a smaller decline in the count of returnees. So Baja California, for example, went from 40 to 31,000, as compared to Zacatecas, which went from 27 to 11,000. So, you know, a 60% versus a 25% decline, so much smaller in the border states. Nuevo León also had a smaller decline, and Mexico City did as well. So Mexico City, the count declined from 17,500 to 15,000. And I just wanted to point out that including Mexico City in that group of border states reminds us that Mexico City became a new interior border as the International Airport of Mexico City was made into an entry port for flights, regular flights of deported people landing from the United States. So I'm going to repeat things that have already been said, including by Brian just right now, but the variation in this space-time pattern of return migration is useful for investigating the causes of return. And so I was thinking about how one might do that. And of course, as has already been alluded, this period variation, so larger numbers in 2000 compared to 2015, suggests the perhaps stronger role of the economy as compared to enforcement or deportation, because high levels of deportation continued after 2010, but the US economy was on a recovery. We also see the fact that smaller declines occurred in border states in Mexico City. These are places where deported people are transferred and where they arrive and settle. And so I think this is also consistent with that pattern. So I was trying to think about how one would test this, and ideally we would construct a panel data set, an annual panel data set, predicting that it would allow you to predict return based on yearly variation in things like enforcement efforts, U.S. economic characteristics, and Mexican economic demographic characteristics. And I wondered, and Claudia, maybe you and I could talk about this later, or you could address this, if you could think of a data set where such a thing could happen, because the census data wouldn't, I don't believe, would allow you, unless you use the circular migration supplement in some way. But I thought about the Inouye panel as a possibility. I know it's a tricky data set to work with, not that I have, but I've heard. I'm very interested, as others have mentioned, in this idea that Mexico has reached the other side of the migration development hump. This, my colleague Philip Martin's idea that, you know, at a population level and in historical purview, net migration increases in size as a country moves through the demographic transition that accompanies economic development and growth. And I thought that, you know, studying patterns of return may provide, you know, empirical clues that support this sort of model, especially in this point. This point just becomes very fundamental, as this is this evidence that we've hit the far side of that hump in Mexico. So allowing us to further situate this current moment in historical time and process, and thereby, you know, using models that incorporate, as Brian talked about, demographic indicators in Mexico. The pattern of selectivity that I referred to in educational patterns of returnees may relate to this as well, as some have argued, and I think it's logical, that migrant selectivity changes over time as a migration flow matures. So this is the result of the growth in social capital networks, reducing the cost of migration, thereby making migration more feasible for a broader swath of the population. One thing that I think about this area of research is that it's not well specified at what level of aggregation it matters for this maturity and flows. Is it the town, the city, and the municipio, the state, or the nation? And of course, that leads to the question of the interdependency between flows, migration flows across space. Brian's point about communication, the extent to which information and resources are shared in networks that span beyond geographic boundaries. So I was thinking that there might be a relationship between state or municipio specific patterns in the characteristics of who migrates and who returns, and national patterns and levels of migration. Anyway, this is a thought that's not well developed, but it was something that occurred to me as I was trying to pose new questions. Of course, to fully answer the question about selectivity, I think Professor King mentioned this, or De Haas, but we need binational data. So we need to compare the full population of migrants, so these, and the populations at risk of migration. So non-movers in origin, movers to the destination, stayers there, and returnees to origin, because there is selectivity in both directions. And I think this is a question we don't have a very great answer to. There's been much more focus on selectivity in out migration than in return. And then, of course, gender is another dimension of that. The fact that 1 in 3 returnees are women, when 1 in 2 people in Mexico are women, reflects patriarchal constraints on women's spatial and social mobility. So when we observe state variation in migrant sex ratios, we can think about 2 possible explanations. One is the one I just mentioned. So the extent to which migration-related social capital in the form of networks, so the extent of migration resources and information that are available to a person, which, you know, theoretically grows with the maturation of a migration flow out of a particular place over time. Those sort of resources and information reduce the costs of patriarchal constraints, making migration more feasible for women, just as it makes it more feasible for others who could not officially afford to migrate, whether that's for financial or social reasons. And then a second explanation for this variation in sex ratios is the extent to which non-migration related meanings and patterns, as they concern gender, vary across contexts in Mexico as the result of other forces. So, you know, if patriarchy, the extent to which it's a force affecting women's relative participation in a basic form of social mobility is more or less strong in different parts of the country. And so I was thinking that if you were to, do a scatter plot between the extent to which a state or a municipio has people participating in migration or return migration and the sex ratio therein, you might see that these ideas work or explain a different sort of segments of the scatter. So I would like to produce that plot and think about that relationship. But anyway, to test them, we would of course move beyond that, incorporating data that provides a measure of the extent of a migration out of a place, or the history, or the availability of migration-related social capital, and then also measures of gender equality. So that could be in the workforce or in household decision-making or in attitudes that vary across space. And so I think that that's an analysis that I can imagine more readily given the data that exists, and would be excited about trying to pursue. I also wanted to just respond to Professor King's point about ontological returnees, which I love that expression, and root migration of US-born adults returning as they are in to Greece and Turkey. And I had not considered that pattern, but I think it's something worth looking into in the Mexican case, and would be an interesting paper to be involved in. I would be interested in being involved in such papers. So thanks for the idea. All right, handing on.
Thank you, Professor Hamilton. Professor De Haas, if you want to continue. I think we can't hear you. I don't know if it's me or...
I think you can hear me now.
Yes.
I have 3 main points to bring in. The first is the diversity of return migrants profile. The second one is from return to circulation. And the third one is on migration transitions. And I think the atlas provokes thoughts on each of these 3 issues. I think if you look at the sort of theoretical approaches, the different theories that try to explain why people migrate, they also have quite different things to say about how to interpret return. For instance, if we start from a sort of classic view of settler migration, the classic sort of US idea of immigration, you would see return as failure. You failed to make it, basically, and that's why you eventually return. Either voluntarily or indeed you get deported, it's a sort of sign of failure. If you would rather adhere to this idea that is very much advocated, for instance, by the new economics of labor migration, all sorts of livelihoods and household approaches that try to see how people still use their agency in very difficult circumstances, migration becomes more this survival of coping strategy in which marginalized people try to improve their long-term well-being and of their families by indeed migrating. And then migration becomes an investment and migrants become target savers. And from that perspective, you could see return migration as success. Once you achieve the goal of accumulating either the money or the knowledge, you return to the origin, place of origin. And of course, we know, many different profiles exist even beyond those 2, I would say, almost stereotypical ways of viewing return migration. But I think it would be really interesting. I don't know what the data can do, but in terms of follow-up, to really try to also better understand, in a way, what different profiles can be distinguished, because that would also give us more information about the social processes driving return migration. Of course, the picture is much more complicated than the dichotomous picture I'm sketching, but I'm doing it on purpose because I don't want to be too long-winding. But I just want to flag that to show, well, there's completely different interpretations, and probably both profiles exist, but I guess many more nuance in between those 2 profiles exist as well. But for instance, the second model really assumes that all migrants are from rural households, and this is a collective strategy. And you could also say, of course, with social transformation and cultural change, there may be more and more migrants migrating more as an individual rather than a family-oriented venture. But that could be part of those broader migration transitions that I would like to speak about a little bit later. Then on patterns of return migration, this is really following up from some of Russell's comments already. And I, of course, had to go back to my own primary fieldwork, which is Morocco. Actually, interestingly enough, 10 years ago, we were involved in a project together with Mexican and Moroccan scholars when I was still at Oxford, trying to compare the migration experiences of both countries. And initially, scholars from both sides of the Atlantic were extremely skeptical. But when we actually did fieldwork, and we actually discovered, despite the completely different historical backgrounds of the countries, both are located, because I would contest Mexico is the only country located straight on this frontier. Morocco actually has a land border with Spain in the two northern cities, but otherwise it's just 50 kilometers from the European mainland. So, and actually striking similarities in patterns. And we've also studied return migration in Morocco, and it in a way follows up from what Russell already was saying, that we really saw different patterns if you look at the geography of return migration. Indeed, in Morocco as well, you have the typical rural out migrant that returns back to the origin village. There's of course also the urban, let's say the modern migrants returning to cities if they return. But what we found interesting, an increasing trend of migrants who left as rural immigrants but resettled in urban areas, mostly located not so much in the main city like Casablanca or the really big cities, but rather in regional growth poles within their regions of origin. So, and that could be explained by a whole set of factors. Those who wanted to invest often prefer to invest in the urban sector, but there were also tensions in families, for instance, that there was too much pressure from the family to share resources. That was a reason for a sort of social distancing of the nuclear family of the migrant going back. But a whole set of reasons explained why return migration of people who originally moved out of rural areas reinforced processes of what Professor Berrian in Morocco calls micro-urbanization. So away from the growth of the big city, but actually accelerating urban growth within or regions of origin. And I was wondering whether that also plays a role if you look in the sort of what we see generally as rural outmigrations. Is it really back to the village, or is it rather going to medium-sized growth centers? And that really sort of inspires me to go back to this idea of comparisons, because we tend to see countries as very unique, and there are, of course, every migration experience is unique. But again, I'm speaking as a geographer. If you look at long-term patterns, listening to Russell about Italy, and my own research in Morocco, and again looking at Mexico, would be really interesting to see whether there's such long-term patterns of migration, return, and that link to rural, urban sort of transformation actually can be found back in other countries. And I think such a sort of systematic comparison could really be, I think, potentially very promising in terms of generating insights. And that brings me to the second point, which is really thinking about return, not just return. I think it's a huge step forward. There's a systematic inquiry of return migration processes, like in this atlas. But shouldn't we take one step further? I mean, if we really want to understand migration, we all know migration is a process. And returnees can remigrate too. And we know that the real natural pattern of many migrations, particularly within countries or across open borders, is rather one of permanent circulation. And as far as I understand the literature, before the US closed its border for Western Hemisphere immigrants around 1965, that was a dominant pattern of Mexican migration. And that brings me to another point. I think it was mentioned by Professor Roberts before, the role of policy. I mean, we all know the work by Douglas Massey and his colleagues that shows that increasing border enforcement has basically pushed migrants into permanent settlement and has interrupted natural patterns of circulation. And in that sense, I think it would be interesting to see to what extent, I'm not sure whether your data can show that, to what extent these returnees are returnees in the sense of the classic sense of people returning and then resettling back home, or are these actually people who would aspire to migrate again or may actually migrate again? And does that differ according to different migration profiles? Because you could expect that those who hold US passports, they would much more sort of resemble those circular migrants because they have de facto free migration rights. And the pattern could be quite different for migrants who don't have these rights. So there was just a question I had. Couldn't this provide a basis for even take a step further to have really this process view of migration, of going back and forth much more continually, instead of, because it could I don't think that's what you try to do, but it could unwillingly create the impression of people return and that's it. And of course, we know there's a richer story behind it. The last point I wanted to raise is the migration transition idea. It was already raised by Erin Hamilton. I think it's important there's sometimes a bit of confusion in the literature that the migration hump, as theorized by Martin and Taylor, was actually about the short-term migratory responses to external trade shocks. And actually they developed that theory around NAFTA when the Clinton administration was trying to sell that economic liberalization package by the idea, oh, this will be great for Mexican development, so it will reduce migration to the US. And they argued, well, any economic shock will create dislocations. Even on the longer term, it's positive. So on the shorter term, you can expect more migration. And some researchers have tried to investigate this. And indeed, the post-NAFTA pattern was indeed a strong increase of migration to the US. So it indeed seemed to confirm that theory. But the migration transition is really, I think we are indebted to Wilbur Zelinsky, who wrote this famous article back in 1971, and also the work with Ronald Skeldon later, who picked this up and put this more in a geographical mold. This is indeed much more about these long-term associations between social transformation, development on the one hand, and immigration. And yeah, I had the same question as Erin actually, is Mexico, I mean, if you look, estimates that have recently been done about sort of levels of economic and human development, Mexico, like Turkey, seems really over the average level of peak immigration, according to those models. But of course, this is a huge average. And I was again thinking, is increasing return migration also not part of the beginning of Mexico's transformation to a country of less immigration, also with the slowing down of rural-urban migration? Because also Zelinsky, the nice thing about Zelinsky's model, he speaks about all types of migration. And it also, I think, relates to Professor Roberts' comment about the rural-urban transition is fully part of this immigration transition. But you would then indeed expect that on the longer term, because the atlas rather looks at short-term fluctuations, I would say, still in the space of 1 to 2 decades. But in the longer term, does it indeed seem to show that Mexico is in this transition and is increasing immigration from Central America, not a first hairbringer of that development? I mean, I asked the same question in the Moroccan context with increased immigration from sub-Saharan Africans, which initially was framed by Moroccan migration researchers as this is all about transit migration, but it seems to really be an incipient form of settlement. And we all know that very small settlement of migrants through the networks often can be just the beginning of a much bigger process of settlement. In other words, is this indicating Mexico's changing position on the global migration map? So these were just a few questions that came out from studying this atlas. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor De Haas. And finally, I would like to ask Professor King for his thoughts on this second round. And I would like to remind the participants that if you have some questions, I'm going to start gathering them on the Q&A section of the WebEx thing. So I'll start receiving your questions as we hear Professor King and Claudia's reactions.
Okay, yeah, my brief for this final section was to address the issue more of sort of theorizing return migration. What can the atlas suggest to us about how return migration should be theorized? And I'm going to do a shameless piece of self-promotion here and just flash in front of you the Handbook of Return Migration, which I've just co-edited with Katie Cushminder, which came out a few weeks ago. And basically, all you ever want to know about return migration but were afraid to ask is kind of in that handbook, because there are something like 25, 30 chapters in there of various aspects of return migration. So I'm going to kind of cherry pick a few kind of comments and ideas from that handbook, and particularly from the introductory chapter, which I co-authored with Katie Cushminder. I mean, the first question I think we ask ourselves is, how do we define return migration? I mean, is it a sort of return, a definitive return back to the home country and a kind of resettlement, which is the conventional conceptualization of return migration. But I think, as Hein, I think as just hinted, that's a too restrictive view. It's also a kind of morally and politically questionable view because it tends to play into a kind of a rhetoric of encouraging migrants to return to where they truly belong. So there's a kind of moral danger about assuming that migrants should return back home because that's where, they naturally belong. Rather, I would suggest we should begin to think about return mobilities. And that term, I'm a little surprised that that term return mobilities hadn't surfaced in our discussion until now, but here it is, return mobilities. And it's about, I think, introducing a mobilities lens to the phenomenon of migration has perhaps two advantages when it comes to looking at return. Firstly, it gives us a kind of temporal typology of return. So anything from a holiday visit to a sojourn to going back for a period of years to permanent settlement. That's a kind of simple temporal typology of return. And some of those may be mutually substitutable. So the notion that I think Claudia referred to some time ago about this idea of always intending to return but never doing so, the so-called myth of return. Often this myth is resolved by making frequent visits. So you may think you will return eventually, but know in your heart of hearts that perhaps you won't do that because it's not practically feasible. And so you compensate for that by kind of linking with the homeland by making annual visits to kind of reaffirm the identificatory links that you have with the homeland. So there's that kind of return mobility, which is temporally variable. And then there's also the notion that return can be embedded within a more complex trajectory of circular migration, onward migration, so that the first time emigration and then followed by the return is by no means the end of the story. There are all sorts of other geographical and temporal trajectories which are also linked to that simple conceptualization of the migration cycle. Another interesting thing which I'd like to pick up, which I think also comes out a little bit of the discussions that my colleagues have contributed to already, is the interface between internal and international return. And this is something which is interesting because this is something which is not brought up in the handbook, which I flashed up just now. And yet it's something which does fascinate me because if we look at migration scholarship, it's really kind of divided into two camps. There are those people who study international migration, and then there's another bunch of people who study internal migration. And on the whole, never the twain shall meet. And I'm very keen that we should bridge that divide, as in fact our hero Wilbur Zelinsky, I mean, not the Zelensky who is the president of Ukraine, who's also another kind of hero in my estimation at the moment, but his near namesake, the population geographer Wilbur Zelinsky, who sadly died a couple of years ago. He wrote this paper, which Hein referred to, but he didn't mention the title of the paper, and the title of the paper is The Hypothesis of the Mobility Transition. So, 50 years ago, because that paper dates from 1971, 50 years ago, Zelinsky was bringing together different types of mobility with migration into a kind of composite historical model, and including the differentiation between internal and international migration. So there are various interconnections here. I mean, I would like to know more about the comparison between internal return migration and international return migration. I would also like to know, actually, I mentioned this before in my previous intervention, that when people leave from one part of Mexico, go abroad and then return to another part of Mexico, that in a sense is a form of delayed internal migration. I also know from my research on Albanian migration, which I've looked at in some detail in recent years, that the classic sequence there is that when Albanian migrants go abroad, typically to Greece or to Italy, they leave from a rural area, and then when they return, they go back to the rural area, but then use the money that they've saved to finance an internal migration from their rural location to usually the capital, Tirana. So there you have a sequence, a transition, if you will, from international migration to internal migration via return migration, which is the kind of reverse of the conventional transition or sequence in migration studies, which is that internal migration leads as a step often towards external migration, international migration. So this interface between internal migration and international migration, which I think Brian and Hein hinted at, is something which I think is worthy of further investigation. Also, the whole gender issue is, I mean, Erin spoke eloquently about this, and I don't have much to say except to kind of reaffirm that, of course, return migration is a deeply gendered phenomenon. The classic kind of model, or the classic pattern, if you like, which is replicated across many studies, across many geographic contexts, is that men are more disposed to return migration than women, because by and large, when men migrate through the jobs that they do, they often lose some of their masculine power. They lose some of their patriarchal power through the migration process. Migration is to some extent empowering for women because they migrate to a more egalitarian society on the whole, although of course there's all sorts of caveats there. And then when men return, particularly if they return to a so-called traditional society, they can reclaim some of their lost masculinity by returning, whereas if women return, then they are forced to conform to some extent to the gender norms of their home country. So that's the kind of classic pattern. Yeah, maybe the final thing that I'll just say is about how return yes, this notion that can we apply the theories and concepts that we apply to migration to return migration? So, you know, how can we operationalize the push-pull model? And of course, we can in return migration. Return migration results from a balance of push and pull factors. Hein mentioned the oppositional kind of interpretations of the neoclassical model with the new economics of labor migration model. That's also highly relevant, of course, to the return theorization. To what extent can we apply Jürgen Carling's aspiration and capabilities model, which is currently quite fashionable in framing emigration? How can we apply that to return migration? Of course we can. You need to want to return, and you need to have the capability to return, assuming that return is by and large a voluntary process. And this also taps in, I think, to Jean-Pierre Casarino's notion of preparedness for return. A successful return is one which is carefully prepared for. So I think there is a number of interesting concepts. I mean, let alone getting into issues of transnationalism and diaspora and mobilities. Mobilities I've touched on already. The way in which we look at return migration can also be on a broader conceptual frame, also looked at through the lens of transnationalism and through the notion of diaspora and diasporic return. And of course, diasporic return also skips one or more generations and goes into the kind of things that I was talking about before. And then finally, we have some interesting subtypes of return, which I think would be worth kind of disaggregating from the overall return pattern. How about, for example, student return migration? When students go abroad, to what extent is their return decision different from other, let's say, migrants of a more labor migrant type? How about retirement return migration, when labor migrants or skilled migrants, for that matter, reach the end of their working lives in the destination country, particularly if they're labor migrants, when they stop stop working. They've literally reached the end of their raison d'etre. And so to what extent is there a retirement migration phenomenon going on? So yeah, I think I'm ending rather abruptly, but I'm conscious that time is moving on. So I have a few other things noted down here, but I think I should stop there in order to give the chair time to manage the final discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor King. And I would like to give some opportunity for Claudia to react to this round of comments and see if we have some time left for questions. If not, I'll make sure that Claudia gets them through email and maybe answers them later.
Yeah, thank you for the comments. And I'll try to be very, very brief. I think I love the discussion, and I love all the references to all the work. In the first round of reactions, I on purpose did not say that one of the big pending issues was the link of internal and international migration, because for me, understanding local conditions is understanding this link. And I mean, all my students know that I always put in my syllabus, mind the gap, trying to understand this link between internal and international migration, the migration development nexus work by Hein. And I think there are two very important things there. When I wrote the paper with Brian and published in 2012, the title is Going Back Home as a question, right? And the main argument back there is that returnment happened to a different community, from the place of origin. And I think we've seen that. I think a lot of qualitative work generated from Mexico has actually also studied that, the role of urban areas. And I love the fact that Brian started talking about urbanization and mortality and fertility, because for me, the demographic transition goes hand in hand with the mobility transition, with the urban transition. And I think it's very clear that with understanding this link between internal and international migration cannot be understood, first of all, between the link of fertility and mortality, but also how Latin American cities grow. And there's a lot of qualitative research understanding re-emigration. I think it will be fascinating to understand the re-emigration of the US-born. In our qualitative work in Mexico City, Erin, Nicole, and I have talked a lot about how the networks of our migrants from Mexico City are actually linked to the networks of internal migrants, right, from traditional sending areas. So I think that this link is definitely interesting. And you see this idea of what happens first. Did they live from a different place from they were born? Did they come back to a different place? I think one of the, after putting in the headline, internal and international migration, I think the second headline of what is missing is understanding better the trajectories, migration trajectories, family trajectories, work trajectories, and how they are linked. And I think the big question is how do we capture data how do we use data and how do we generate data that captures all these trajectories in both sides of the border, right? And I think that the third headline of what is missing, and I see all the time, behind all your questions and comments, is what is the role of local conditions? And I think that in the case of Mexico, what is missing still in the discussion is the role of violence and security, and just the idea that there are places that are not as attractive to come back to, right? And this refers directly to the link between internal and international migration, between internal displacement that has also peaked in the years that we saw. And the big, the next headline, I think, is changes in selectivity. And there's some work that I did trying to actually see how selectivity before and after the recession changed, using the 2010 data that's out in a book that we're launching. We're presenting in the 31st, talking about how the decade that migration changed. And yes, there are changes in selectivity, but to measure changes in selectivity of emigration and return, we need binational data, right? Or we need kind of like interesting tricks to actually realize what is the population subject to return. And I think this is the big question, right? In terms of theories and processes, I love the idea of thinking on return mobilities. I hate to hear often when I present about return, this idea that there is no theory of return migration. I've had these discussions before. I mean, the problem is, I think that migration theory has been somehow neglectful of return, just as Mexican scholarship for many years was, I wouldn't say neglectful of return, but was conceiving return in this circular pattern, this circular vision. So in a way, even having these trajectories was a change, and even understanding that re-immigration can occur is also important. And finally, just to trying to like highlight this bump of 2010, yes, there was an increase of return, of people who could potentially re-emigrate because they were US citizens or permanent residents. So, and this you could see a little bit with some old data of 2010, but it's still unclear who goes back and forth, right? And I think that I'm gonna leave it there, but I think just finally yesterday, someone asked me if return was something unique to from the Mexican case, and in a podcast that I recorded, and I was like, no. I mean, I think migration is and return migration are happening all the time everywhere. The problem is how we define return, and I think, and I like my experience so far talking to returnees is that they will never say I am a return migrant, right? They might say, yeah, I came back to my country, I am here, I'm back. But the true reality, and with this I really finish, is that and the idea of having this compass and the end of the video highlighting that many in Mexico wish to go back to the US is this idea that many will not be able to do so. And most of the Mexican migrants were not able to visit their home country for 20 years because they had an irregular status that prevented them to actually maintain contact with their home country. So their networks are diluted and their links are diluted, and it's really hard to come back to a country that they don't know, where their social networks have disappeared. And this idea that if they were able to visit, or if they were even able to send more remittances, then they would have a better context of reception upon return. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there because I do think we need to move on, but I really appreciate all the comments, and I wish and I hope that we can jointly move return migration theory and studies forward with all the pending issues that still stay open.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you everyone for this enlightening conversation and all the questions and things that remain open for work and exploration in the future. Because of time, I think we can. We're gonna do the raffle of the books of the gifted books. I'm gonna say the names of the 3 people selected, and we'll contact you by email, the email you registered with. I'm not sure if those people are here right now, but we'll send them an email. So the winners are Berta León, Marisela Daniel.
But that's my mom. We should redo that raffle because she's
okay,
my
so
mom.
no Berta León. Berta León already has the book. Okay, so
I mean, this is a copy. She has it.
okay.
No, you should redo the raffle.
Okay, so
you can share the screen if you want.
Maybe Mariana, you can share the screen, and we can redo the raffle and select those 3, and I'll send you an email to the winners.
I know that many is watching the video. I mean, the transmission on YouTube, and we said that it would be those on WebEx. So, but if you are on YouTube, just signal and I'll see, because I know that there were actually some questions on YouTube as well.
Yes.
Okay, I will start the raffle.
Yeah, I saw Patricia.
Flores. Wait, okay.
I'm gonna again, Berta León.
Wait.
Perhaps your mother should get a lottery ticket today.
Citlali Cabrera.
Uh-huh.
And there was another winner, Marisela Daniel.
Marisela Daniel. Okay. So I'll send the three of them an email with the details to get their books. And I think, I mean, I don't know, Claudia, what you think. I think I can share with you some of the questions that were shared in YouTube and see if you want to answer them right now, or maybe just take them home and answer them later. So one of the questions was, what would be the main purpose of bilateral coordination between the US and Mexico? And why is there so little coordination between these two countries when it comes to migration? And the others are more comments in terms of the need to study the structural interaction between migration and internal migration and international migration, and other comments that were made throughout the presentation. So, I mean, I think it's time to end the seminar. I mean, I'm willing to stay here for longer, but I don't know about the rest of you. So I think, Claudia, you can give a farewell, and then I'll just close the event very briefly.
Well, no, I'll just end very briefly thanking everyone. And for those who haven't seen the book, the physical copy is with this format. It's also available as an ebook. I think it reads much better in print, but it's available in both in English and Spanish. Hopefully, we'll be able to print later in English. But I think that regardless of how it is presented, I really hope that we can think on return migration together differently. And the idea of putting the pending issues at the end of each chapter for each state was really just, I mean, hoping that more questions are open. And I really like the discussion today because I think really we opened a lot of questions. So I think, I mean, I see research as this collaborative work where we really read, comment, and just work together. So thanks a lot. And yeah, thank you for being here. And yeah, I'll just, yeah, I think, I mean, Erin mentioned some papers that she wants to write. We hope we all write them at some point and collaborate. So it's great. And I mean, I'll just end up thinking, I mean, it's a book produced by Colegio de Mexico and that received a lot of support. And I know Jaime Sobrino is here. He was the director of the center when I proposed the book, and he works on internal migration. So I guess he also had an interest in return because he was interested in internal migration. And but I see lots of different colleagues present, and so it's a very nice day. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Claudia, and congratulations. It's been a pleasure to hear you all and to meet some of you virtually. And thank you, everyone, for joining the conversation and for listening. And a big thank you to Alberto Chavarria, Cristina Portas, Jessica Cusacabe, Tania Ochoa, Fernando, Mariana, and all the people that helped us organize and put everything together for this important event. And just a reminder that you can follow all the events organized by MIGDEP in our webpage and our Twitter account, Seminario MIGDEP. And well, thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon, and thank you, Claudia, for the honor of chairing this conversation.
I wish we were in person and we were able to toast, but
Yes.
soon, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Russell.
Thank you.
Oh, nice meeting you.
Yeah, nice meeting you all as well. Yeah.
I knew Hein, but I didn't know you in person. So, Tanya.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Brian. Thanks. Ahí está Francisco.
Muy bien, pues creo que
Se terminó la transmisión.